Welcome back to the History of the Ancient Near East. I'm your instructor, Justin Singleton. Now in this lecture, we're going to discuss understanding biblical wisdom, or as wisdom is personified in the text, Lady Wisdom, and how she stands for a pure belief system. Now, we're talking about this specifically in order to contrast Lady Wisdom with Dame Folly, who many scholars understand as a very specific Canaanite goddess, Asherah by name. As my dog is barking, this is my reminder to remind you, please forgive all of the intrusions. Dogs barking, eating, scratching, whatever they're doing. Just hang in there with me and forgive me. Okay, specifically, we're going to be discussing wisdom versus folly, including their associated terms, before looking into these two women, Lady Wisdom, including where she appears in the text and her characteristics, and Dame Folly, looking into the same. Finally, we're going to look at Dame Folly as a goddess or merely an anti-Yahwist, discussing wisdom as a type of pure Yahwism, like pure religion, if you will, and folly as not. Pure religion where Yahweh is the center of that religion. Pure Yahwism. What we can call, we would call it today biblical Christianity, or biblical Yahwism. Okay, in this part of the study, punctular time events move away from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and now into the Levant. Here, the reader will discover only a few examples of punctular time based on the geographical and social time aspects of Braudelian historiography. Specifically here, the student of history begins an exploration of true wisdom. Now, as one approaches the Hebrew text in search for wisdom, one is met with several challenges, one being our language and another being our culture. While core theological truths are easily understood as they span culture and time, it's also true that an understanding of both the language and the culture of the Bible allow for a greater and deeper understanding of those truths. This is apparent when one searches for biblical wisdom. Now, there's no doubt that the ancient Israelites lived in an open environment, and they learned from those around them, including politics, language, culture, literature, and even worship. It's no less apparent that Israel stood out against her neighbors theologically and philosophically. Now, because of these philosophical and theological differences, much must be understood in order to come to any usable concepts of biblical wisdom, especially as the opposite of biblical wisdom can be seen in non-Hebraic religions and philosophies, including the socioeconomic climate of the southern Levant. Now, let me throw in a little extra tidbit here, not in my notes, but when discussing the socioeconomic climate of any region, you have to understand that the socioeconomic climate molds the individual. That's true in modern times as well as the ancient. So in those of us who are United States citizens, we tend to have a kind of American thing about us. We tend to be rebellious. We tend to be loud and obnoxious. We tend to be, American. And the same can be said of the Hebrews who lived in Canaan. Remember, the Hebrews did not kick all the Canaanites out, so they had Canaanite influence throughout their lives. And living in the Canaanite socioeconomic climate, one has to figure out, okay, how do I grow crops? Well, my crops don't seem to be growing well. Well, what did the Canaanites do? Well, they worship Baal. Oh, okay, well, maybe that'll work for me too. So you can see how the socioeconomic climates in the southern Levant could influence the Israelites. Okay, forgive me for that. Moving on. Okay, of note, there appears in the biblical text both a concept of wisdom and of folly, as noted in Proverbs 1 through 7, where the gaining of wisdom is said to be the purpose of the book of Proverbs, and where fools are said to be those who hate it. Within that passage, Solomon urges the readers to acknowledge that true wisdom stems from fearing God, fearing Yahweh, as a part of the monotheistic religion of the Israelites. But throughout the book, the author also urges against the strange or foreign woman, who not only stands as a physical representation of foreign deities, such as Baal, Asherah, Astarte, but as an antithesis to pure Yahwism. Now, a rather interesting association is discovered in Proverbs 1 through 7, where the term wisdom, chachma in Hebrew, is exemplified with cognitive, rhetorical, and moral terminology, including cognitive terms such as instruction, understanding, shrewdness, knowledge, skill or guidance, discretion, and fear of the Lord. As rhetorical terminology, the readers offered proverb, parable, and riddle. Finally, the moral terminology associated with biblical wisdom is righteousness, justice, and equity. Now, additional terms are associated with biblical wisdom can be found outside of Proverbs 1 through 7, including words like counsel in Proverbs 8:14, sound wisdom, also in 8:14, understanding in 1 Chronicles 22:12, and of course simply wise. And these are all terms that can be added to the cognitive terminology mentioned here. Interestingly, biblical wisdom appears to have a sense of skillfulness to it, including labor skills such as the skill in making religious garments and spinning goat's hair. Now, perhaps the gist of the idea can be taken from Exodus 35:35, which associates chachma with engraving, designing, embroidering, preparing colored materials, working with fine linen, weaving, and the craftsman in all the work. Now, beyond this, the term is associated with a more general craftsmanship. For example, in Exodus 31:3, where chachma is juxtaposed to understanding, knowledge, and craftsmanship. Outside the Pentateuch, in 1 Kings 7:14, the reader will find a man who is filled with chachma and understanding and skill for doing any work in bronze. Thus, this idea of biblical wisdom can be clarified as a sort of life skill. That is, the ability of the individual to conduct his or her life in the best possible way and to the best possible effect. Now, of course, this also means that wisdom can be learned. It's a skill, after all. Now, beyond the skillfulness of biblical wisdom is its relationship to the fear of the Lord. This concept is a fundamental theological idea in the book of Proverbs. In fact, it can be said that this fear of the Lord is deeply embedded in all of the Hebrew wisdom literature in general. One rendering of this phrase used in Proverbs 1:7 reads, "Fearing the Lord is the beginning of moral knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Now, the positioning as the opening phrase of the theme of the book gives great credence to its relationship with wisdom. In fact, this passage links the phrase directly to wisdom. Proverbs 9:10 does so even more when it says, "The beginning of wisdom is to fear the Lord, and acknowledging the Holy One is understanding." Thus, the fear of God, by definition, means that there is no true wisdom or knowledge apart from a relationship with Yahweh. Now, what is the fear of the Lord? Well, the fear of the Lord is twofold. First, It's recognizing who God is and responding with a genuine fear to displease or disobey him, knowing that God is an all-consuming fire. But it's also the conscious choice to adopt God's attitude towards sin. Remember that he hates it and he has no tolerance toward it. And to demonstrate such an attitude towards sin by choosing only the things that please God. Now, where the word wisdom has a lengthy list of terms associated with it, so the word folly has associated terms as well, though not as long of a list. There are 4 Hebrew words traditionally rendered fool, and associated with these terms are their abstract nouns rendered folly. Now, additional associated terms include simple or gullible, mindless, senseless, and even mocker. Sometimes these words are understood or translated as the word stupid when in reference to practical things, and insolent when in reference to religious concepts. Now, note that the idea of dull or obstinate, it's not referring to one's mental deficiency, but rather to one's predisposition to make wrong choices. Thus, a fool is said to be someone who is always morally bad, despises wisdom, mocks at guilt, is quarrelsome, licentious, and it's useless to attempt to teach him. Okay, if the fear of the Lord is the essential principle of wisdom, then folly necessarily equals the lack of such fear. This contrast is made clear in Ecclesiastes 10:2, as it states, "A wise person's good sense protects him, but a fool's lack of sense leaves him vulnerable." This idea could be more directly translated as a wise man's heart is at his right hand. The right hand equals protection. But the heart of the fool is at his left hand, or the wrong hand. Forgive me, left-handed people. Perhaps in common colloquial, one could say that the fool doesn't know his left from his right, or at least he doesn't live as if he did. Additionally, a series of contrasts can be found in Proverbs chapters 10 through 15, where the reader will find a greater concentration of antithetical statements involving folly, including chapter 10, verse 1, 8, 14, 21, and so forth. These contrasts are sometimes overt, such as the way of a fool is right in his own opinion, but the one who listens to advice is wise. And sometimes it's simply implied, such as the one who conceals hatred utters lies, and the one who spreads slander is certainly a fool. As a heuristic tool, the author refers to 2 key women throughout Proverbs, Lady Wisdom and Dame Folly. Lady Wisdom is given eminence by her positioning at the beginning, Proverbs 1, middle, Proverbs 8 through 9, and end of the book, Proverbs 31. And also in the fact that she does not simply stand there. She acts out of her wisdom. She calls out to those in the street to join her, and she lives a complete and wholesome life, as evidenced in Proverbs 31. Now, note that an Old Testament human example of Lady Wisdom, someone who is without any objection lived out wisdom to its fullest, obviously cannot be found. But the reader is given an idealized and applicatory example to follow in Proverbs 31. Interestingly, Lady Wisdom as a personification of wisdom appears only in the book of Proverbs, the main text of which come from Proverbs 1, chapters 1 through 9, but specifically chapters 1, 3, 4, 7, 8, and 9. In a realized sense, she's also found in Proverbs 31, which is a subtext. Here, Lady Wisdom is never named, but the description of the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31 fits the general description of Lady Wisdom. Now, gathering information about Lady Wisdom from her appearances within the text, certain characteristics can be identified. Above all, Lady Wisdom appears to be a woman who fears Yahweh. This is implied directly from Wisdom's connection to fearing God, but more importantly, in that the beginning, middle, and ending passages concerning Lady Wisdom also contain reference to the fear of the Lord. This makes our Lady Wisdom to be a godly woman, an example to all. With remembrance of Proverbs 2:4's seeking wisdom like a hidden treasure, Lady Wisdom is said to be more precious than jewels, and nothing we desire compares with her. This desire appears to be directly related throughout the text with the young man's desire for a good wife, especially in Proverbs 7:4, where the father says to his son to call Wisdom his sister. I know that sounds weird, but sister is a familiar term in the Song of Solomon for declaring one's love. In this instance, Lady Wisdom is seen as a fiancée, a future wife in love. As the young man begins his family, Lady Wisdom becomes a mother. Her motherly ways are seen not only in Proverbs 31, both in King Lemuel's mother and in the virtuous woman, but also in Proverbs 8:32, where Wisdom says, "So now, children, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways." Beyond the roles of fiancée, wife, and mother, Lady Wisdom acts primarily as a teacher. This can be seen all throughout the Lady Wisdom text, but specifically in Proverbs 1, verses 20 and following. Here, Lady Wisdom calls out to the men, warning them not to disregard her words and rebuking them. For example, in 123, she says, "If only you will respond to my rebuke." What happens if they do ignore her rebuke? She states in 126, "I myself will laugh when disaster strikes you." Now, just to point out, that is not God laughing, that is the personification of wisdom laughing. Now, Lady Wisdom is then seen as a realization or application of biblical wisdom. And biblical wisdom is that idea of entrenching oneself in the fear of the Lord, in the very covenant between God and man. In modern times, exegetes could say that biblical wisdom is this idea of allowing God's word, through his grace, to guide them along the path of life. Again, this idea of a life skill comes into play. Now, because of this idea of a life skill, these teachings of Lady Wisdom are of great importance, and a symbolism of marriage should be carried through these ideals. The main point is that the young man should marry himself to biblical wisdom while he's young. In fact, this marriage to wisdom is an individualistic way of understanding the national marriage covenant of Israel to Yahweh. It isn't enough that the nation is married to God. Each individual must also find himself in a covenant marriage with Yahweh. Now, this being the case, the contrast with Dame Folly becomes all the more important. While Lady Wisdom is spoken of by name more than Dame Folly, the facts discovered about Dame Folly are striking. Dame Folly appears within the text very little, but her weight is carried throughout. In fact, as the antithesis to Lady Wisdom, it could be said that her character is found in most biblical proverbs, at least those in antithetical parallelism. Specifically, though, one finds Dame Folly in one main text and several subtexts. The main text appearing with Dame Folly by name, and the subtext giving a realized expression of her nature. The one main text is found in Proverbs 9:13 through 18, and is closely associated with Lady Wisdom, as she is in direct contrast. This passage begins, "The woman called Folly is brash. She's naive, and she doesn't know anything." While this verse has been rather difficult to translate, this translation, New English translation, does well to show the overall nature of the woman. The subtext containing Dame Folly never named the individual as Folly, but her characteristics match those of Folly found in Proverbs 9. These being broken down into two groups, the strange woman passages and the foreign woman passages. These are found in Proverbs chapters 2, 5, 6, 7, and 9, in the attached verses there. Just to note, I see a little mess up there. The very last one is chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, and then again verses 13 to 18. Now, taking characteristics from the main text and the subtext, the reader can understand Dame Folly as an evil woman, not simple, but wicked. Note her personality as described in the passages. In Proverbs 2:17, the reader is told that she leaves the husband from her younger days and forgets her marriage covenant made before God. She's not committed. Also note that she lies in wait for her victims. This illustrates the evil desire within her heart as she preys on precious life. The fact that she acts like a prostitute might warrant a quick extension of her attributes outside of the Dame Folly passages in order to note that the prostitute lies in wait like a robber and increases the unfaithful among men. Now, her attitude is such that she is brash. She's also loud and rebellious. Generally speaking, Dame Folly is an unstable woman and does not even know it. A part of this instability is her boldness, as seen in the seizing and kissing of her prey. Indeed, the exegete is later told in Proverbs 30, verse 20, that an adulterous woman believes that she's done nothing wrong. The reader is told that Dame Folly lurks about in the night. She flatters with her words. And this can be seen in two very clear examples. Chapter 7, verses 13 to 20, where she convinces her prey, and 9:17, where it's stated that stolen waters are sweet. The reader is told by Lady Wisdom herself that the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, but Dame Folly's house is the way to the grave, going down to the chambers of death. Chapter 17, verse 27. Ultimately, Dame Folly's sin is against God himself, as seen by the fact that she forgets her marriage covenant made before God, or as the New American Standard Bible translates it, forgets the covenant of her God. That's 2:17. In the end, Dame Folly matches well with our previous understanding of what folly is, notably the rejecting of the fear of the Lord and rejecting God himself. The direct connection between Lady Wisdom to the Old Testament covenant stirs an important implication concerning her antithesis. Namely, if Lady Wisdom stands for all that is good within Yahwism, in fact, pure Yahwism, then necessarily Dame Folly must stand as the antithesis to pure Yahwism. Lady Wisdom is linked directly with the covenant. But not only is there a link, there's a call for all the young men of Israel to bind themselves to this covenant. In essence, this is a call to pure Yahwism. But this can only be understood as such when the culture of the Hebrews is taken into account. Interestingly, the life of Solomon, the author of Proverbs, stands in contrast to the spirit of the Davidic age. While David cannot be understood as the perfect example of wisdom for mankind, it can be claimed that he was a pure monotheist, holding Yahweh as the one and only true God. This is understood throughout the text, but the primary inference for this claim comes from his perfect heart. 1 Kings 11:4 uses the Hebrew phrase, levav shalem. In contrast, Solomon did not have a perfect heart, as expressed in that same passage. Here the text reads, when Solomon became old, his wives shifted his allegiance to other gods. He was not wholeheartedly devoted, levavo shalem, to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. It then appears quite troublesome that Proverbs 1 through 9, containing such an emphasis upon a fear of God, a pure Yahwism, rather than a blurring of the two as is observed in the life of Solomon. Perhaps these writings could be understood as the mature thoughts of Solomon. After living such a foolish life, Solomon instructs his readers in the better ways of skillful living within a framework of the fear of the Lord, rather than the approach he once took. Now, Solomon could never attain a perfect heart because he's already personally betrayed his God. But Solomon could teach those he led astray to correct this in later generations. Yeah, at least one could hope that this is the case. The antithetical nature of Dame Folly is such that any designation of Lady Wisdom to pure Yahwism by nature demands some sort of antithesis to pure Yahwism. What better antithesis can there be than that of the syncretistic Canaanite Israelite religion, especially in terms of a Canaanite goddess? Take for evidence of a mixture a large storage jar from the early 8th century that contains an inscription concerning the northern kingdom, Israel, or Samaria, of the northern kingdom deity, that reads, "I blessed you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah." By Yahweh and his Asherah. Asherah being commonly known as the consort of Baal. Thus, Yahweh is mixed together with Baal. Now, what's found in the real Israel is that although God had moved his prophets and certain people to call for pure Yahwism, most of the people tried to move in a different direction, thus establishing new religious ideas. Because of this syncretism, some of them attempted to equate Dame Folly with Asherah, a well-known Canaanite deity. While the issue of who Asherah is has not yet been settled, we do know that she was represented as a tree, pole, or image of wood. Trees were hewn down and with their branches removed to the sacred places. In the course of time, the trees were trimmed into more or less artistic pillars or were carved as statues. While notably not the best translation of the word, the King James renders the term Asherah or Asherah as grove, a mistranslation based on the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, and probably due to the nature of the tree concept. Apparently I was supposed to push that. There's Asherah on the left and Baal on the right. Now, iconography of the Asherah is often shown as a tree of fertility, and therefore a tree of life. While Dame Folly is never associated with a tree in the text, her antithesis is called a tree of life in Proverbs 3:18. Now, rather than accepting Lady Wisdom as the Asherah, as some scholars have attempted to do, the tree of life motif could in fact be an assault on the Asherah, showing instead that the acceptance of the law is in all actuality the tree of life. Lady Wisdom appears then to be a sort of counter-advertisement to Dame Folly. Although Lady Wisdom undoubtedly stood as a counter-advertisement to the goddess Asherah, limiting the antithesis of biblical wisdom to the goddess Asherah eisegetically delimits the extent of the passage. If Lady Wisdom is equated as pure Yahwism, which she appears to be, then Dame Folly stands in opposition to that fact. Now, rather than simply relating Dame Folly to a single Canaanite goddess, the antithesis to pure Yahwism would necessarily be Anti-Yahwism, a concept readily seen in the Old Testament. Anti-Yahwism can be observed in two forms within the Hebraic Bible: the replacement of Yahweh with Baal and the mixing of Yahweh with Baal. This mixture, as seen in the beliefs and established cult of Jeroboam, is a form of syncretism, the mixing together of religious beliefs and practices, often seen through the lenses of the socioeconomic norm of the society in question. Now, perhaps in biblical times, this could be described as Canaanite Yahwism, the mixing of Canaanite socioeconomic norms with Yahwistic worship. Today, this may be seen in the United States as maybe American Christianity, or American Yahwism, if you will, American Christianity. The mixing together of American ideals, socioeconomic norms, with the biblical text. Well, you probably thought that this was going to end up being all linguistics, and I apologize for all the linguistics at the beginning. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed the lecture. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you need anything.